When you give us the house as a wedding gift, we'll finally have enough room to actually start a real family. My brother Warren said it, the way someone announces what they're ordering for dinner. Like it was already decided, and I just hadn't been told yet. He was cutting into a piece of brisket at my parents' kitchen table in Sandy Springs, not even looking at me when he said it. His fiancée Ingrid was sitting beside him, nodding, her engagement ring catching the overhead light every time she moved her hand. My mother reached across the table and squeezed my arm like I had already agreed to something wonderful. My father set down his fork and looked at me with that particular expression he reserves for when he's already decided how a situation is going to go and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. All four of them were staring at me. I picked up my glass of iced tea, took a slow sip, set it back down, and said no. The table went quiet in a way that felt almost medical. My name is Reese. I'm 33 years old, and I own an architectural design firm I built from nothing in Atlanta over the past 8 years. Before the firm had a name or a client or an office, I was working from a shared desk at a co-working space in Midtown, taking on residential additions and commercial facade jobs for clients who sometimes paid in installments and occasionally didn't pay at all. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic with a cracked dashboard until I was almost 30. I kept a running budget in a notebook. I ate a lot of sad lunches at my desk, but I was working towards something I could see clearly, and I never took my eye off it. 4 years ago, I bought a 1920s craftsman estate in Virginia Highland, one of the oldest and most distinctive residential neighborhoods in Atlanta. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a backyard anchored by 2 oak trees that were old before the house was even built, and a detached carriage house I converted into my design studio. The property had been sitting in an estate sale for 2 years before I found it, half finished, the restoration scope too intimidating for most buyers. For me, it was exactly the kind of problem I'd spent my whole career learning how to solve. I brought in a historic preservation consultant. I spent 18 months making deliberate choices about every single detail. The original heart pine floors, the restored coffered ceilings in the front rooms, the beveled glass on the main door. When the work was complete, the property appraised at $4.9 million. The number on that appraisal is not what makes the house mine. The 2 years of drawings on my drafting table, while I figured out how to afford it, those are what make it mine. My brother Warren is 4 years older than me. He has rented the same 1-bedroom apartment in Decatur for 6 years. He works in medical device sales, though the specifics of his commission situation shift in ways that never quite get explained at family dinners. Our parents treat him with a tenderness they have never extended to me, which I say not with bitterness, but with the plain accuracy of someone who spent 30 years watching the dynamic operate in real time. Warren is the beloved one. I am the dependable one. He is the one they worry about. I am the one they rely on. Neither of us chose those roles. Warren and Ingrid got engaged in October. Within 2 weeks of the ring going on her finger, the question of where they would live after the wedding became the Holloway family's full-time preoccupation. What I did not know at that dinner, or rather what I pretended not to know, was that the conversation had already been held without me. My mother had apparently floated the idea to Ingrid before Warren had even mentioned it to her, which meant that by the time Warren said those words over the brisket, it wasn't a request. It was a vote that had been taken while I was out of the room, and Friday's dinner was just the announcement. The logic, as my mother laid it out after the table went quiet, was perfectly rational to everyone but me. I lived alone. 4 bedrooms for one person was simply excessive. Warren and Ingrid needed space to raise a family. Wasn't it a beautiful thing that I was in a position to give them that start? Family takes care of family, Reese. You've always known that. My father added that I could easily rent something smaller and more practical. Something appropriate for my situation. He said, "Your situation," in a tone that was meant to remind me that being 33 and single and childless was a kind of failure I should be accommodating rather than a life I had freely chosen. It landed the way he intended it to, briefly, before I recognized it for what it was. Ingrid said nothing during most of this, but she smiled at me across the table. In a way I recognized immediately. The smile of someone who had already mentally repainted my living room and decided the carriage house would make a wonderful home gym. I said no a second time. And then, because I had already done something very specific 3 days before this dinner, I added, "But I'm willing to sit down with my attorney on Friday to discuss it properly." My mother exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for an hour. Warren leaned back in his chair. My father said, "Good. That's all we're asking. Just a conversation." I drove home that night, down surface streets instead of the highway, because I needed the time. I sat on my porch in the dark for a while, with the lights off, just listening to the neighborhood settle in around me. I had built something real. And I had also, 3 years before that dinner, done something that Warren had never known about. Something that lived in a signed and notarized document. In the offices of Hugh Sterling, my estate attorney, on Peachtree Road in Buckhead. I had set a very careful trap. I just hadn't expected to ever need to spring it. 3 years before that dinner, my parents' finances had come apart quietly, the way those things often do. Gradually, and then all at once. My father's contracting business, which had operated on thin margins for years, lost 3 large commercial contracts in the same quarter and fell into serious debt. The second mortgage they had taken out on their Sandy Springs home, the house my brother and I grew up in, which they had owned free and clear, before the business trouble, was 4 months in default. The bank had begun the foreclosure process. My mother called me on a Tuesday in March while I was between client meetings. She was crying so hard, I could barely parse what she was saying. She hadn't told Warren, she said. She didn't want Warren to worry. I drove to Sandy Springs that night and sat at their kitchen table and looked at the numbers. The payoff amount to stop the foreclosure was $312,000. The bank needed it within 60 days. I had it. Not comfortably, but I had it. My firm had just closed a significant contract with a hospitality group, and the retained earnings had been sitting in a separate account while I decided what to do with them. I made a decision at that kitchen table that I have never regretted. But I didn't write a check and hand it over. I called Hugh first. Hugh Sterling is precise, measured, and not easily impressed by anything. When I explained the situation to him, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "If you're going to do this, we do it with documentation. I'll draft a promissory note with a specific performance clause. You want to be protected? We put it in writing." We put it in writing. My parents signed a formal promissory note for $312,000 at a nominal interest rate of 2%. The note was secured by a performance agreement, not a lien on their property, but a legally enforceable document that stated plainly, if either signatory or any party acting at their direction or encouragement attempted to claim, demand, pressure, or coerce any transfer of Reese Holloway's primary residence or any other real property held in her name, the full outstanding balance of the loan, plus accrued interest, became immediately due and payable, and Reese Holloway reserved the right to pursue all available legal remedies. My parents signed it at Hugh's conference table. My father shook Hugh's hand afterward and said he would never forget what I had done for the family. My mother cried happy tears for about 4 minutes, and then called to make a reservation at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try. They had been making monthly payments to Hugh's trust account ever since. As of the November dinner, they still owed $241,000. Warren knew none of this. Friday arrived. I wore a gray blazer I had bought specifically because it makes me feel like someone who has already won the argument before it starts. I got to Hugh's office on Peachtree Road 10 minutes early and sat in the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor and watched the morning fog sitting over Buckhead and thought about nothing in particular. They arrived as a group. My father first, holding the elevator door for the others, then my mother, then Warren, then Ingrid. Ingrid was carrying what I can only describe as a design portfolio, thick, spiral-bound, with color-printed photographs behind plastic sleeves. She set it on the conference table before she sat down and pushed it across toward me, the way someone passes a business proposal to a potential investor. "We've been going back and forth on the bedroom situation," she said, not looking at me but at the cover of the portfolio. The fourth bedroom off the back hallway would convert beautifully into a nursery, obviously, and Warren and I talked about the carriage house. Since neither of us needs a home office, we'd probably convert it into a proper garage, maybe add a fitness space in the upper half. She looked up at me then. "No offense. My carriage house studio is where I run my entire firm. It contains my drafting tables, a full materials library, a quarter-scale model of every significant project I've completed in the past 4 years, and a reading chair I sourced from an architectural salvage dealer in Savannah. No offense." My father slid a manila folder across to Hugh before Hugh had even fully opened his briefcase. "We've drafted a standard quitclaim deed. Simple transfer. We'd like to move through this efficiently. Warren and Ingrid need to start talking to contractors before spring if they want to make progress on the renovations before the wedding." Hugh looked at the folder. He did not pick it up. He set his briefcase on the table, unclipped the latches with both hands, and removed a navy blue binder with a white adhesive label on the spine. The label read, "Holloway Estate File. Promissory Note and Performance Agreement, Sterling Law Group." He placed it in the exact center of the conference table. "Before we discuss any transfer of property," Hugh said, in the tone of voice he probably uses when informing someone that their appeal has already been decided, "there is an existing legal instrument governing this situation that all parties in this room need to be aware of." Warren looked at the binder. "What is that?" Hugh opened it. He turned to a tabbed section, laid the document flat, and oriented it toward the center of the table so everyone could see it. He pointed to 2 signatures at the bottom. "My parents' signatures, notarized. February, 3 years ago." 3 years ago, Hugh said, Reese Holloway provided a private loan of $312,000 to Leonard and Gloria Holloway to prevent the foreclosure of their primary residence in Sandy Springs. This promissory note is the governing instrument for that loan. As of this week, the outstanding principal balance is $241,000. The conference room went so quiet, I could hear the HVAC system running. My father's face did something I had never seen it do before. It didn't go pale, exactly. It went still in the way a face goes when the brain is receiving information it cannot yet fit into the version of events it has been operating with. He looked at the binder. He looked at me. He looked back at the binder. He found his own signature. I watched him read it. Then I watched him read it again. My mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Warren said, "What?" Not as a question. Just the word flat, like something falling. Additionally, Hugh continued, turning to the next tabbed section, "The promissory note contains a specific performance clause, which both signatories agreed to and executed at the time. That clause states explicitly that any attempt by either signatory or any party acting at their direction or encouragement to claim, demand, coerce, or otherwise pressure the transfer of Reese Holloway's primary residence constitutes a triggering event. Upon a triggering event, the full remaining balance of the loan becomes immediately due and payable." He folded his hands on top of the binder. "Your arrival at this office this morning, for this purpose, is a triggering event." Warren turned to look at my father. His voice had dropped to something quiet and unrecognizable. "You borrowed $312,000 from Reese." My father said nothing. He was still looking at his own name in ink. "Dad." Warren's voice cracked on the word in a way I had not heard since he was a teenager. "You told me Mom's inheritance covered the mortgage issue. You said there was a family account. You said." "We didn't want you to worry," my mother said. Almost word for word. Almost exactly what she had said to me on the phone 3 years ago in March. Recycled now and aimed at the wrong person. The same protection being extended in the wrong direction, the same way it had always been. I sat very still. Ingrid had closed the portfolio sometime in the last 2 minutes. Both her hands were flat on the table. She was looking at the center of the binder and not at any of us, and I could see something moving behind her expression that wasn't grief and wasn't anger. It was the particular look of someone doing very fast arithmetic in private. "The house in Sandy Springs," she said, and her voice was careful and even, the voice of someone working through a problem out loud. "If the note were called due and not paid, there could be a lien on it." "That is among the available remedies, yes," Hugh said. Ingrid nodded once, very slowly. She picked the portfolio up from the table and slid it back into her bag. She stood, collected her coat from the back of her chair, and said, in a completely neutral tone, "I'm going to step outside for a moment." Then she pushed through the glass door into the hallway. She did not come back. Warren pressed both hands over his face for a moment. When he lowered them, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him since he was 19 and had wrecked our father's truck and had to tell him about it. That raw, undefended look of someone whose entire understanding of a situation has just shifted under them without warning. "You paid off their house," he said, "and you never said anything. For 3 years." "I didn't want you to worry," I said. I meant it exactly the way it sounded. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and broken. He looked up at the ceiling. My father slowly got to his feet. He picked up the quitclaim deed from in front of Hugh, where it had been sitting untouched this whole time, and he held it in both hands and looked at it. Then he set it back on the table and smoothed the corner of it with 2 fingers, a reflexive gesture that had no purpose, like straightening a piece of paper that didn't need straightening. "We didn't know about the clause," he said. His voice was much quieter than I was used to. "You signed the document, Leonard," Hugh said, not without kindness. My mother was crying, not the loud, dramatic crying she sometimes deployed at family dinners, but the quieter kind she only did when she had run out of other moves. She reached across the table toward me, the same way she had at the dinner on Tuesday, the same reach, the same angle. This time I shifted slightly, and her hand landed on the table edge instead of my arm. "Reese." She said my name like it was 2 things at once, a question and an apology. "Tell Hugh we can work something out. Tell him we'll fix this. We're family. You can't just—" I stood up. I buttoned the single button on my gray blazer. I picked up my bag. I looked at the 3 of them. My father standing with his hands resting on the table. My mother crying quietly into the back of her wrist. My brother staring at a fixed point on the floor, working through something that was going to take him a long time to fully process. I looked at the empty chair, where Ingrid had been sitting. "I didn't take anything from you," I said. "I saved your house. I protected what I built." Those are 2 different things, and I'm not going to apologize for either one of them. I walked out. I took the elevator down to the lobby. I walked through the glass doors and out into the cold November air on Peachtree Road and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing. Then I went to my car and drove home across the city, on surface streets with both windows cracked, even though it was 44 degrees outside, because I needed the air moving through. The weeks that followed came to me in pieces, mostly through my cousin Blythe, who is the only person in my family who maintains communication with everyone simultaneously and judges no one. Ingrid ended the engagement quietly, about 2 weeks after that Friday. She didn't give Warren a formal explanation. She simply said she needed space and then took it permanently. The Napa Valley venue they had booked for the wedding, which I had clocked on Ingrid's Instagram as one of those places with an 18-month waitlist, was canceled. Warren moved out of the Decatur apartment and into a smaller place in Smyrna. My parents called me 14 times in the first month. I let every call go to voicemail. I wasn't avoiding them as punishment. I was avoiding them because I knew myself well enough to know that if I picked up before I was ready, I would either say something I couldn't take back or agree to something I didn't actually mean, and I had come too far and worked too long to let a moment of guilt undo my own clarity. The voicemails were all variations on the same theme. It was a misunderstanding. Warren was struggling. Couldn't we all please sit down together? They were sorry about the loan and how it all came out. They should have handled it differently. Couldn't we start over? I didn't call back. Not yet. But I wasn't closing a door either. I was just not opening one before I was ready to walk through it. What I did instead was wake up early every morning and make coffee in my kitchen, the kitchen with the original subway tile and the window over the sink that looks out over the backyard and the 2 oak trees. I sat at my drafting table in the carriage house and pushed myself back into the Chattanooga project I'd been neglecting for 2 months. I had dinner with friends on Wednesday nights. I slept without the low-level tension that had been living just below my ribcage for longer than I'd allowed myself to acknowledge. I thought about Warren more than I expected to. Not with any satisfaction, which would have been an easy and shallow thing to feel. What I felt instead was more complicated. A kind of sadness for the structure we had both grown up inside. Where he was the one who got protected, and I was the one who did the protecting. And neither of us had been given the chance to understand what that arrangement was costing us both. I hadn't told him about the loan because I hadn't wanted him to feel guilty. My parents hadn't told him because they hadn't wanted him to worry. All 3 of us had spent years organizing ourselves around his comfort, without once asking whether that was actually good for him, or for any of us. It wasn't, as it turned out. You don't do someone a favor by keeping them in a version of reality that has to be maintained with secrets. 6 weeks after the Friday meeting, Warren sent me a text. It was short. It said, "I didn't know about the mortgage. I should have known, but I didn't. I'm sorry I let them put me in that room without understanding the whole picture. I'm not asking you to call them. I just wanted to say that." I read it 3 times standing in my kitchen. Then I carried my phone out to the porch and sat in the rocking chair with the late afternoon light coming in sideways through the oaks, and I thought about what I actually wanted. Not the expedient thing. Not the satisfying thing. Not the thing that would make everyone stop calling. What I genuinely wanted. I wanted my brother to understand what had happened in that conference room and what had happened long before it. I thought from his text that maybe he was starting to. I wrote back 2 days later. "Thank you. I mean that. Let's get coffee when you're ready." We haven't had that coffee yet, but the door is open, and 2 months ago, I wasn't sure it ever would be again. Here's what I want to say to anyone watching this who has ever had a family member stand across a table and assume that your hard work is available to them by right of relation. People who have never had to fight for something they built often mistake holding onto it for selfishness. They confuse self-preservation with greed because they have never had to tell the 2 things apart. Protecting what you built is not the same thing as taking something from someone else. Saying no to an unreasonable demand is not a failure of love. And using a legal document that you created years in advance in good faith to protect yourself from exactly the pressure that materialized. That is not a betrayal. That is called being prepared. I saved my parents' house. I did it without telling anyone, without asking for recognition, without ever bringing it up at a family dinner. I used the protection I had built into that transaction only when they walked into an attorney's office and tried to take the only thing I had ever built entirely for myself. And even then, I did not pursue the remedy. I just showed them what it was. The note is still active. My parents make their payment on the 15th of each month. What happens with that balance in the long run is a decision that I will make from a position of clarity when the time is right and the conversation is an honest one, not a coerced one. That's not something I need to figure out today. Most mornings, I take my coffee out to the porch before I open my laptop. The neighborhood wakes up slowly in November. A dog being walked, a car backing out, the specific quality of Atlanta light through old trees in the cold. My house is still my house. I built it. I nearly let it be taken from me by the quiet assumption that love means surrender. It doesn't. Love is something you build carefully, with people who are willing to do the work of it honestly. Everything else is just pressure wearing a familiar face. So I want to ask you, if you had been sitting in that conference room, would you have let the trap spring? Or would you have walked out without saying anything, just to make the silence stop? Tell me in the comments. And tell me the city you're watching from, because I genuinely want to know how far this story has reached. If you've ever had to protect something you built from someone who expected you to hand it over, I want to hear about it below. Subscribe if this one hit close to home. I'll be back with more.